How's the sound, by the way? Okay. Good. All right. Perfect. So this class is about the concept of perpetual joy. Now, we'll get to some background information on this, but I'd like to share a screen with you and show you, excuse me, and show you the 5 verses. There are 5 verses that discuss the idea of joy. Actually, this one is not a verse, but I'll explain why soon enough. And the concept is as follows: what does it mean to have to lead a joyful life? So for some people, unfortunately, I guess leading a joyful life means getting high or something like that. For other people, perhaps it's the little, joys that you get along the way. The birth of a child, the marriage of a child, and so on and so forth. Your own marriage also. All of these things are obviously occasions for joy. But what is perpetual joy? We'll get to that soon. There is a concept in Jewish thought that is called the Korban Tomid. The Korban Tomid means the perpetual sacrifice. Literally, that's the way to explain it. That's the translation. But it's not actually perpetual. It simply happens to be that it's done every day, twice a day, and that's what it's perpetual is about. It's not that something always burning on the altar. There's a sacrifice in the morning and one in the evening. Now, the whole concept of sacrifice, obviously, is very foreign to most of us because we don't live in that kind of society. This doesn't go on in Jewish life today, only in temple times. But the concept of sacrifice is not what you would think. It's not something to please the gods, propitiate the gods, etc., etc. The whole concept of sacrifice is to get close to God. The word korban in Hebrew, korban. Let me see if I can share a screen over here. 1 second, I'll have to stop share for a minute. And then share whiteboard. Okay, there you go. So, I'm assuming you can see the whiteboard here. The word korban. Oops. All right, never mind. Korban. The word korban in Hebrew means, it comes from the same word as the word karov. Karov means closeness. To bring yourself close. So the concept of a korban, of a sacrifice, was not that the animal was being sacrificed or that the flower or whatever it happened to be was being sacrificed or libation on the altar and so on and so forth. The actual sacrifice on the altar was less important to a certain extent than the intention of it. In other words, of course, the sacrifice had to be brought, and it was a sacrifice that's ordained by Scripture, and it has its tremendous importance, no question about it. However, without the proper intention, we tend to think of sacrifice as a sacrifice of an animal. That's not true. The whole internal idea of a sacrifice is not sacrificing something, but bringing yourself closer. And that, to a certain extent, is a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of your ego, because the only thing that separates us from God, from the divine, is the concept of ego. Ego means I'm an independent entity, so to speak. And therefore, that's a separation already. So the whole concept of sacrifice, korban, is to bring yourself closer. This was done twice a day, in the morning and towards evening, late afternoon towards evening, called the Tamid Shel Shachris, Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, the sacrifice that's the sacrifice that is offered in the morning and in the evening. In other words, the beginning of the day and more or less the end of the day, in order to remind a person that the beginning of the day, which is critical to one's mindset, the beginning of the day should be, I'm coming closer, or at least I'm trying to come closer. The end of the day, again, before we go to sleep, is I'm trying to come closer. I'm bringing myself closer. So that the whole day, essentially, is the idea of bringing ourselves closer. Now, what does that have to do with joy? Well, we'll speak about that now. Let us, again, share a screen. These verses over here are talking about the concept. The first verse starts with the idea of service, serving God with joy. Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. Serve God with joy. Now, what does that mean? Usually the concept of service is usually associated with a burden, with slavery to a certain extent, with servitude. Of course, we are all servants in one way or another of God, but the trick, so to speak, is to do things with joy, meaning to say that to see the service itself as a burden is exactly the wrong thing to do. It's an opportunity. It's a privilege, to put it that way. In other words, my life in a general sense is dedicated to the idea that I have this privilege of being a servant of God, essentially. Now, in terms of joy, this is discussed in the various Kabbalistic and Chassidic works in particular. This is the joy of what is called Nephesh, the joy of Nephesh, the lowest level of joy. In other words, there's 5 levels. There's actually 5 levels of soul, or if you want to put it in this terminology, 5 levels of consciousness. The lowest level of consciousness is my physical awareness, my awareness of my physical being and my physical surroundings. A lot of this consciousness has to do with the senses and how the senses are sense what's going on around me, sense the world around me. If, when I am living my daily life, I take, at least at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, I take a few minutes to think about what a privilege it is simply to be alive and to be able to interact with our surroundings, and to be, whether it's, there are some people who join us that do not have the ability to see. In other words, they were blind, either born blind or became blind by accident. And there's a certain dimension of the world that you would think that they're lacking. The truth is that a person that doesn't have sight often has insight. In other words, sight doesn't appear in the eyes, but sight is a function actually of the sphira of Chokhmah. Let me just put this on the screen, and you will see that the sphira of Chokhmah is the first of the imminent sphirot. Keter is a transcendent sphira. Chokhmah is the first of the imminent sphirot. Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit later. But this is the idea of Nephesh. The idea of Nephesh is I'm alive and I have the privilege of life and interaction with the world around me. And more than anything else, I have the privilege of having the ability to bring myself closer to godliness, to bring myself closer to holiness, etc. That's the lowest level of joy. There's a higher level of joy, which is called V'samachta b'chagecha, rejoice in your festivals. Actually, festivals here should probably be with capital F. Rejoice in your festivals. This idea of rejoicing in your festivals is actually a verse in Deuteronomy, as you can see. The first is also a verse in Psalms. The second is a verse in Deuteronomy 16:14, that we actually have an obligation, a biblical obligation, that when the festivals come around, there's three main festivals of the year, three biblical festivals. The festival of Passover, which is coming up soon, in another few months, another 3 months, 2.5 months. The festival of Passover, the festival of Sukkot, which is tabernacles, and then the festival of Shavuot. Shavuot is when the Torah was given. Those are the three biblical festivals that are mentioned in the Torah, that are mentioned in Scripture. Those festivals there's an obligation to rejoice. There are rabbinical festivals as well. For example, Hanukkah, which celebrates the victory of the Maccabees over the Greek Empire, and Purim, which celebrates the survival of the Jewish people against the decree of Haman, who gave the decree to kill all men, women, and children in Persia at that time. Unbeknownst to him, or perhaps yes, beknownst to him, there was Esther. Esther was actually the queen, Queen Esther. She was the queen, the wife of the Emperor Ahasuerus. That was his name, Ahasuerus, in Hebrew anyway. And he had married Esther. He before he got married, he sought out all the maidens and so on and so forth in the kingdom. And for whatever reason it was, he chose Esther. And she was the one that actually was very instrumental, primarily instrumental in saving the Jewish people. That's the festival of Purim. Now, Purim is an extremely happy festival, and I'm going to come to that at the end when we get to the fifth level of rejoicing. We'll get to that soon. But in any event, there is a biblical commandment to rejoice in the festival. That corresponds to the level of Ruach. Ruach is emotional consciousness. It's not physical consciousness, but emotional consciousness, emotional awareness, so to speak, or consciousness of the world around us and the world inside us through our emotions, through the arousal or otherwise of our inner emotions. That's called Ruach. The word Ruach itself means wind, but in this particular case, it means a level of consciousness. Okay. Later on in, I forgot to mention what verse this is. This is a verse in Isaiah. Which after my besasoin, you shall draw water. This is the water drawing ceremony. You shall draw water with joy. What was the drawing of water with joy? Well, there was all of the year round, there was a libation of wine on the altar. There was only one time or one period of time during the Festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot, that water was poured onto the altar. It's learned out. It's not stated directly, but it's learned out from the end letters of 3 verses that talk about the various libations and the offerings that were made on the Festival of Tabernacles. And it spells out the word mayim, water, which is a subject that I'm actually going to get to in a later lecture, what the concept of water really represents. There's some fascinating ideas and teachings in Kabbalah and Chassidic texts and so on and so forth that discuss the whole concept of water. Water is a very, very unusual commodity, even though it covers 3/4 or 2/3 of the earth, 3/4, I think it is, of the earth. Nevertheless, it's a very unusual commodity in the universe. It seems to be at least very unusual. And it has some very interesting spiritual properties that one day we are going to talk about. In any event, this verse in Isaiah says that when you draw the water for the libation on the altar, after my besason, you have to draw the water with joy. You have to draw the water with joy, and that's poured out onto the altar. Now, this is not a biblical obligation. It's mentioned in connection with a biblical commandment, but the joy is not mentioned as such. It's more of a rabbinical requirement that when you draw the water, that's drawn with joy. In fact, when they went to draw the water from the from the water of the Shiloh River in Wales that were outside the temple area, they were dancing and dancing and dancing the whole day. I mean, it went on for hours and hours and hours. It was dancing. There was a tremendous amount of celebration and happiness and so on and so forth in drawing the water. Now, on the spiritual plane, that corresponds to the level of neshama. What's neshama? Neshama corresponds to, in the Sfirot, it actually corresponds to the higher three faculties of a person: Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. What's Chokhmah? Wisdom. Bina, understanding. And Da'at is consciousness or awareness, or the ability of discernment is also part of Da'at. But that is the idea of neshama. So drawing water with joy on this occasion was an expression, essentially, of neshama, expression of the expression of that level of the soul, which is, or that level of consciousness, which is called the neshama, intellectual consciousness of themes and ideas and theories, I guess you could say as well, that sort of light up the soul. In other words, inspiring ideas. That is the level of neshama. And therefore, when it comes to expressing the neshama, this opportunity to express this deep level of consciousness, that has to be done with joy. Why is it done with joy? The very fact that we have these abilities is already an excuse. Excuse is the wrong word, but it's a reason and a cause of joy. Now, drawing out water from the wells is also symbolic. In other words, it's meant as a metaphor. Drawing water with joy is drawing down essentially what is the source of life with joy. But it's a source of life not only in the terms of life on earth without water would cease to exist. We don't mean it in that sense only in the physical sense, but we do mean that the drawing of the water is instrumental in giving us an understanding of not where, but what life is all about. Water has several, as I said before, several interesting properties, but some of the revealed properties of water are simply that it cleanses. Water cleanses. Water quenches thirst, obviously. Water is also known to make things stick together. That's because the chemical bonds of water are actually very, very powerful. H2O. Those are very powerful, and they cause this idea of what is called in Kabbalistic terminology, Chassidic terminology, Dveikut. Dveikut means cleaving to the one above. When soul cleaves to soul, soul with a small s cleaves to soul with a capital S. In other words, when the soul of an individual, his consciousness, his higher level of consciousness, or even a neshama consciousness, cleaves to a higher level of divine manifestation. In other words, this dveikut is a time of not just simple joy, but even more than joy, the concept of ecstasy. Dveikut is associated with ecstasy. how can you be davuk? How can you cleave to something much greater than yourself by losing yourself completely, essentially? Baal Shem Tov was actually known for his tremendous degree of dveikut, his cleaving on high, and his ability to maintain that for not just very long periods of time, but throughout his day, throughout his life, essentially. He was known to be always davuk, cleaving up above. In other words, there was no ego there. There was no me, and that is part of the joy of the drawing of water. The drawing of water up from the wells means that what's hidden in the wells or what's hidden in the springs is the water is hidden over there. When it's drawn up and it's drawn up into various vessels, then the water is contained, the water is visible, the water becomes manifested, the water becomes useful, and this idea is that joy becomes manifested in various aspects of life. Hopefully, not just in various aspects of life, but in all aspects of life. That's drawing the water with joy. We then come to the final, not the final, the semi-final idea of the rejoicing that takes place on the last day of the Festival of Tabernacles. The last day of the Festival of Tabernacles in Israel is called Shmini Atzeres. It's the 8th day of ingathering, when everyone gathers together in temple times. That's the 8th day of the Festival of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And then on that day, they read from the Torah and they completed the Torah. They completed the reading of the Torah. In other words, the Torah starts with Bereshit, with Genesis, and goes all the way through to the end of Deuteronomy. And the end of Deuteronomy, once completed, then you start again. But the joy of completion of something, bringing something to its completion, bringing something to its fullness, bringing something to its state of perfection, essentially, that's the rejoicing in the Torah. There's 53, according to some 54, it depends how you divide them, 54 sections, 54 what are called parashiyot, or some people call it a sedra, but there's 54 or 53 main topics of the Torah, which are divided into the 53 weeks, essentially, the 53 weeks of the year. Now, some of them, there's not always 53 weeks in there, there's really 52. So some of the parashiyot are joined together, but nevertheless, in the Torah, they're sort of independent, they're regarded as independent or separate parashiyot, separate sections. But the rejoicing in the Torah is the rejoicing on the level of Chaya Shebenefesh. What's Chaya Shebenefesh? Go back to our diagram. Now we're talking about a level of Keter. In Keter itself, there's actually two primary levels. The lower level of Keter is what is ultimately the origin of all of the other Sfirot. It corresponds in the human being to the power of will, the power of the will. It's called Arich Anpin. In Kabbalistic terminology, Arich Anpin literally translated means long faces. Long face doesn't mean anything. It just means that it is the aspect of Keter that permeates all of the other Sfirot all the way through to Malchut. That's why it's called long. And it's called face, long face, because it's not the back of it, so to speak, but the internal aspect of it that permeates all the way through all of the Sfirot. So therefore it's called Arich Anpin, the long face. In other words, the long revelation of divine will in the creation of the world. So to get back to our verse and to get back to what we're talking about over here, the concept of Simchat Torah, rejoicing in the Torah, is rejoicing in the completion of the Torah. But it's not only that. Our sages tell us that it's not just that we rejoice in the Torah, it's that the Torah rejoices in us as well. It's not the rejoicing in the Torah, but the rejoicing of the Torah. The Torah rejoices in the Jewish people. Why? The Zohar explains as follows. There are three things that are bound together. There's the Jewish people, Israel, there's the Torah, and there's God. All three are bound together. Now, generally it's explained like this, that it says that there are three bonds. There are three bonds. Israel is joined to the Torah. In other words, our attachment to God is through the Torah, through scripture, through the Bible, through biblical teachings, and not only biblical teachings, but all the teachings of Judaism are called Torah, as long as they're authentic, obviously. In other words, even the rabbinical teachings are called Torah, even though they're not scripture. It's all the writings of the 5 books of Moses, the writings of the prophets, and altogether 24 books of scripture. And then the writings of the rabbis in Mishnah and Talmud and so on and so forth, and then ultimately landing up in the code of Jewish law called the Shulchan Aruch, and other authentic Jewish works. All of that is called the Torah. But it's not only that we rejoice in the completion of the Torah, it's that the Torah rejoices in being the means by which it can bind us to God. That's part of the celebration, right? And then the Torah, obviously, itself is bound to God. So there's two knots so far. Israel, this is what the Zohar says. Israel is bound to the Torah, and the Torah is bound to the Blessed Holy One, in other words, to God, right? Oraisa Israel, Oraisa Kuchabrichu. Israel is Kashram Oraisa. Israel is bound to the Torah, but Oraisa Miskasheres like Lekuchabrichu is bound to the Holy One, blessed be He. Now the question is, where's the third knot? That said, there's 3 knots. We only see 2. Israel is bound to the Torah is bound to God. Where's the third one? So the third one is really that Israel is bound to God independent of the Torah, above the level of the Torah. Because the truth is, there's a whole discussion amongst the rabbis in Midrash, Tanad Valiyahu, and the Pikar de Rabbi Elazar, and various other places, Midrash Rabbah. The Midrashic literature discusses which came first, which takes primary position. Is it the Torah that takes primary position, or is it Israel that takes the primary position? And the conclusion is that Israel takes the primary position. Why? Because the Torah itself says, when God gives his commands, speak to the Jewish people. In other words, the Torah is there for the Jewish people. So the bond between the Jewish people and God transcends the Torah. And that's the celebration of the Torah, why the Torah itself is rejoicing, why the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and the 24 books of scripture, and all of Torah are rejoicing in the fact that the Jewish people is bound to God and therefore increases the boundaries of Torah all the time. Now, when I say increases the boundaries of Torah, of course, there's limitations on how this can be increased. But one of the expressions of the rabbis is that the Torah was given to us la'afashallah, meaning to expand it. In other words, to expand it expand the authentic Torah. You don't change the Torah, but you expand the reach of the Torah into your life, into everything. Into everything that you're involved with. And that means, therefore, that the boundaries, so to speak, of Torah are expanded. More and more comes to be included in that holiness, in that idea of the sacredness of divine law of divine will, which is divine law is the expression of divine will. That's the rejoicing of the Torah. That's the level of Chaya, as we said before, the lower level of Keter. But when we talk about the last verse, V'tov lev mishte tamid, a good-hearted person is always celebrating from Proverbs, that corresponds to the highest level of the soul. The highest level of the soul is called Yechida. Yechida is that which is always bound to God. It never becomes separated, never can become separated. It's always bound. It's part of God above, so to speak. So to speak is actually the wrong. It is part of God above. That's what it is. Part, so to speak. That there is the highest level. Now, why is it the highest level? Why is that the highest level of joy? You would think that maybe the previous level would be the higher level of joy. The reason is as follows. In order to be able to explain this, I have to explain another concept. As we know, there is the festival of Purim, which we spoke about before. The festival where Haman, the evil Haman, in other words, the latter-day Hitler, was basically overthrown primarily by the working behind the scenes of Esther and her uncle Mordechai, the great tzaddik, the great righteous, saintly Mordechai, working behind the scenes to overturn the edict of Haman to destroy the entire Jewish people. And eventually he was destroyed. He was hung with all 10 of his sons. All of them were hung in public and ended their lives in absolute shame and disgrace. Now, the festival of Purim occurs in the month of Adar. The month that we're in now is actually also the month of Adar. But there actually sometimes in the lunar cycle, the Hebrew calendar goes according to the lunar cycle, but the lunar cycle is brought in sync with the solar cycle. The solar cycle is 365 and a quarter days, and the lunar cycle is 354 point something days. So let's say 354 days to 365 days, there's 11 days that are missing. So every approximately, it's not exactly, but every 3 years, more or less, you have what is called an Ibur Chodesh, an additional month that is added to the calendar. And that additional month always happens in the month of Adar. So you have Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni. Purim is in the second Adar, in the Adar that is closest to Passover, because it goes the calendar goes Adar and then Nisan. Adar is the month before Passover. It's always the month before Passover. Purim is always celebrated in the month before Passover. But in the first Adar, there is no Purim. But the rabbis instituted that we have something called Purim Katan, the small Purim. What does the small Purim mean? It means not the original, not the proper Purim that's a rabbinically required festival, but it's what's called a minhag. It's a custom. It's a custom to celebrate on that particular day to some extent. And how do you celebrate? You celebrate because, one of the ways of celebrating, obviously, is to have a meal and to have family around and so on and so forth. But the concept is captured in this concept, on this idea, in this verse. A good-hearted person is always celebrating. A good-hearted person is always celebrating. A good-hearted person in the first month of Adar, which is not the official month of Adar. The second month is the official month, so to speak. The first month is just the fill-in month to return the cycle to its to synchronize it with the solar calendar. So that first month is therefore the Purim Katan, the small Purim is only a custom. It's customary. There's no real obligations of any sort. And that, therefore, is the greatest expression of joy. In all of the other um, types of joy and all the other levels of joy, there's an obligation, whether the obligation is biblical, as we see in the first three verses, or whether the obligation is rabbinic. And this is not just rabbinic, but it's actually an obligation of the prophets instituted this idea essentially of the rejoicing in the Torah by completing, when we complete the Torah. But this last one here is only it's a custom. In other words, there's no obligation. And because there's no obligation, that's the greatest joy. If you're obligated to do something, if you're obligated to be joyful in some way or another, the obligation lessens and minimizes, to some extent anyway, minimizes the joy. It reduces the joy. Why? Because anything that you're obligated to, you have to do it. Let's take an example now of what's going on in current politics. I really don't like talking about politics, but it is a good analogy. Most of the people who are protesting in Canada, the truckers and so on, if I'm sure most of you are aware of what's going on, the truckers protest, 90% of the truckers have actually been vaccinated. There's only 10% that are not vaccinated. What are they protesting against? They're protesting against mandates. You have to. As soon as you tell somebody you have to, I mean, if anyone has kids, you know how that works. If you tell the kid they have to, well, they do have to do it. It's true. And they're going to. But very often, depending on how it's said and depending on how it's presented, you have to do something means that you're going to do it with resentment in one sense or another. Now, all of these levels of joy, I wouldn't say that people do it with any resentment in their hearts. I don't think they do it with resentment. But the fact that there is a commandment sort of means that it comes from outside of you. It doesn't come from inside of you. Whereas the last thing, a good-hearted person is always celebrating, that comes from within inside you. That's your own desire to celebrate the fact that you have what you have, that you have a relationship with God, that you have a relationship with your soul, essentially, a relationship with your consciousness, that you have a relationship which is not obligatory, it's just completely natural. It's your yechida, that's who you are. In other words, that level of yechida that's who you are. When your yechida is in a state of revelation, then the person is always in a state of celebrating. Now, I actually knew people who were like this. There's probably more, I know people who are like this as well, but I certainly, when I was in my yeshiva years, when I was studying in yeshiva, there was a person, I think I've told the story before, but Mendel Futafas. Rabbi Mendel Futafas was a prisoner in the Russian camps, in the Gulag for many, many years, I think 20 years. He was imprisoned for the sole crime of practicing his religion. But he was a very dynamic and very extremely spiritual person, and he became the head of the academy, the head of the yeshiva, one of the heads of the yeshiva in which I was studying. And there's a story told about him. I think I told the story before, but in any event, he had a very good friend. And he knew that the friend had also been incarcerated in one of these camps. And he knew that he was in the same camp, but the way they organized things, the way the Russian police force or whatever it was, the NKVD, the way they organized things was they tried to isolate prisoners from anybody that they knew, and that in order to crush their spirit. So Remendel was always looking for this friend of his, and his friend was looking for him because he also knew that Remendel was in the camps, and they didn't meet each other for years. In any event, after a few years, they happened to go to the bathroom at the same time. I kind of met in the bathroom. And Mendel looked at his friend, and he could see that he was terribly depressed. And he said to him, "So, how are things going?" So his friend, like, very dejected and very sad, said, "What do you mean? How are things going? Things are terrible. I'm not able to do fulfill any of the commandments, like eating um, matzah on Pesach. Matzah is the unleavened bread that we eat on Passover, biblical commandment. I'm not able to put on tefillin phylacteries. I'm not able to keep the Sabbath properly because they force you to work on the Sabbath. The Jewish prisoners, they're forced to work on Sabbath, and so on and so forth. There were all kinds of things that, I mean, they're trying to get out of it as far as possible, to do as little type of work that's forbidden as possible. But anyway, life is very tough. So he said, life is really, really tough. So Reb Mendel said to him, he said, your body, they have in captivity. Don't let them put your spirit in captivity. Don't let them put your soul in captivity. And the man said later on that encounter that he had with his dear friend, Reb Mendel, saved his life. He would have died of probably of dejection, of depression, and so on and so forth, when he realized that he had the opportunity to express, even in the worst possible circumstances that you could imagine, he had the opportunity to understand that he doesn't have to allow his essence to be captured, his soul to be captured and imprisoned by the Russian authorities. That liberated him already. That idea of liberation is what we call a good-hearted person is always celebrating. He's celebrating the fact that he's connected no matter what. Even if he cannot fulfill any of the commandments, never, if he cannot. If he can, then he ought to, obviously. But if he can't, he's still celebrating the fact that he's part of God above. Again, part, so to speak. Because God doesn't have parts, obviously. But he's celebrating that fact that I am a, so to speak, piece of godliness. I'm a piece of God. And that can never be tainted, it can never be captured, it can never be forced into submission. It's free. And that is the highest level of joy. When a person realizes that in essence they are free, that is the ultimate level of joy. That's perpetual joy. And therefore it says at the end, Tomid, the word Tomid means perpetual, always. He's always celebrating, right? Always. That's the idea. The always means that there's no time when there's no celebration at all, because the person is always connected to God, always. And therefore, he's always celebrating. There's always the expression. Someone who's reached this level is always expressing that joy in being connected. Okay, folks, that is it. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I see there is something in the chat over here. Just answer the question. Was it still work with Baal Shem to remain joyful daily with the achievement level that eliminated the lack of joyful? He eliminated the lack of joy. In other words, he was always in a state of joy, even when he was dealing with very, very serious issues. But there was an inner joy. You can see when people are in a state of joy, when they're in a state of real, what's called simcha in Hebrew, the word simcha, joy. It radiates from them. You can see it, like it radiates in their face, it radiates in their mannerisms. And it's something very inspiring to see. I knew this Rabbi Mendel very well. He was always chuckling about things. He wasn't chuckling at people's problems, but he was sort of chuckling at how seriously people take their problems, because half of the solution to a person's problems are attitude. And if you change your attitude, the problem is maybe still, an inconvenience or a difficulty or a barrier of some sort or another, but it's not seen as something life-threatening, so to speak. And a lot of people, I mean, I'm sure all of us are probably included in this. A lot of people have, exaggerate their suffering to the point that it really becomes a burden. Now, they don't do it deliberately necessarily, but they simply do it because they aren't aware of all these things that we've been talking about. Is there a difference between being joyful and being happy? In the Hebrew, I don't think there's really a difference between the two of them. There are various words for joy and for celebration and so on, and for happiness in Hebrew. The word for happiness is ashrei, actually. Happy are those that dwell in God's house, happy. But that word ashrei is also an expression of, it's an expression of the highest level of soul. So happiness and joy on the highest level are really the same thing, essentially, it seems to me. Interesting question, but there may be in psychology, there may be differences, I don't know, but in Jewish thought, not really, not necessarily. All right. Any other questions, folks? Should we leave it at that? I think so. Okay. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them by email. KabbalahDecoded@gmail.com. Kabbalah with an H on the end, decoded, all one word, KabbalahDecoded@gmail.com. And if you want to drop me a line and ask questions or whatever it is, just connect. I'd be very happy to respond. Maybe not right away, but I will respond. All the best, everybody, and see you again, hopefully next time. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate your good wishes. I don't know if I should tell everybody this, but anyway, I'm undergoing chemo at the moment. That's basically the bottom line. And I'm over halfway through, but that is the situation. Not pleasant, not easy, but it's not the end of the world. Things will improve. But I am at times, unfortunately, very weak. So, that's why I haven't been giving classes all the time. And okay, let's leave it at that. All the best. See you around, and be happy. Don't worry.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. All the best, everybody. Good night.
All the best for you, Rabbi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye now.